The Merchant of Venice, Part I. A Merry Bond. Shunned, hated, despised, insulted, the Jews in the Middle Ages led a cruel and embittered existence among their Christian brethren. But beaten down and oppressed as they were in most of the countries of Europe, they still prospered as far as money matters were concerned, and in spite of the demands continually levied on them, they contrived to amass large hoards of wealth. When the great nobles or merchant princes of those days got into difficulties, it was to the Jews they turned for help, and the enormous sums charged as interest for the loan enabled the Jews to fill their coffers rapidly. Shylock was one of the richest Jews in Venice, although he lived in a wretched, penurious style, with only a clownish lad to act as servant. Shylock had one child, a pretty, flighty daughter called Jessica, whose nature was very different from her father's. Jessica was gay, extravagant, without much heart, and with no respect or affection for her own race and kindred. She longed to free herself from the miserly restraint of her father's house, and to join in the amusements from which his severity debarred her. Not only this, but she had become acquainted with a handsome young Venetian called Lorenzo. She had secretly promised to become his wife, and intended on the first opportunity to elope with Lorenzo and give up the Jewish religion. Shylock hated all Christians, which was scarcely to be wondered at, considering the way in which he had been treated, but the special object of his aversion was a certain wealthy merchant named Antonio. Shylock hated Antonio partly because, whenever they happened to meet, the merchant treated him with contemptuous scorn, but chiefly because Antonio lent out money gratis, and so brought down the rate of usury in Venice. Antonio had also at different times released poor people whom Shylock had imprisoned for debt, and often on the Rialto, which was the public place in Venice where the merchants congregated, Antonio had railed against the grasping avarice of the Jewish extortioner. Thus Antonio had wounded Shylock in the two most intense passions of his life: his pride of race, for in his own way Shylock was a strict follower of his religion, and his love of money. Shylock brooded over his wrongs, and if ever the opportunity came when he could gratify his ancient grudge, he resolved to be bitterly revenged. He had long to wait, but at last his chance came. Antonio had a friend called Bassanio, a gallant, high-spirited gentleman, but one whose open-handed, generous disposition made him spend more freely than his means allowed. Bassanio was in love with a beautiful lady called Portia, and had good reason for believing that he was looked on with an eye of favor. He would gladly have come forward in earnest as a suitor for her hand, but his somewhat extravagant mode of living had for the moment exhausted his means, and it was impossible for him to appear at Belmont, Portia's house, in the style befitting a suitor. Antonio, who was devoted to Bassanio, had often helped him before, and on this occasion Bassanio turned to him again. Antonio was more than ready to help, and placed all he possessed at Bassanio's disposal. But unfortunately at that moment he could not lay his hand on a large sum of ready money, for all his fortune was on the high seas. However, he made Bassanio go forth and see what his credit could do in Venice, and he promised to become surety to the uttermost of his means, in order that Bassanio might be fittingly equipped on his quest to Belmont. In his search for money, Bassanio came across Shylock, one of the chief usurers in Venice, and to him he applied for a loan. Shylock did not at first appear very willing to grant his request. 3,000 ducats? Well, he said in a pondering, deliberate fashion. Aye, sir, for 3 months, said Bassanio. For 3 months, well, for which, as I told you, Antonio shall be bound. Antonio shall become bound? Well, echoed Shylock, still in the same slow voice. "Can you help me? Will you oblige me? Shall I know your answer?" said Bassanio rather impatiently. 3,000 ducats for 3 months, and Antonio bound, murmured the Jew reflectively. "Your answer to that?" demanded Bassanio. "Antonio is a good man," mused Shylock. "Have you heard any imputation to the contrary?" "Oh, no. My meaning in saying he is a good man is to have you understand me that he is sufficient. Yet his means are in supposition. He hath an argosy bound to Tripolis, another to the Indies. I understand, moreover, on the Rialto, he hath a third at Mexico, a fourth for England, and other ventures he hath squandered abroad. But ships are but boards, sailors but men. There be land rats and water rats, land thieves and water thieves, I mean pirates. And then there is the peril of waters, winds, and rocks. The man is, notwithstanding, sufficient. I think I may take his bond." "Be assured you may," said Bassanio. "I will be assured I may," said Shylock with a sudden snarl, "and that I will be assured I will bethink me. May I speak with Antonio?" "Here he comes," said Bassanio, and at that moment Antonio joined them. The merchant repeated the request that Bassanio had already made, and pressed Shylock for his answer. Could he oblige them with the loan? Then, for a moment of ungovernable fury, long-hoarded venom broke forth. He reminded Antonio of the pitiless contempt with which he had always treated him, of the way in which he had publicly heaped insults and abuse on him. "It now appears you need my help," continued Shylock bitterly. "You come to me and you say, 'Shylock, we would have money.' You say so, that spurn me as you would a stranger cur over your threshold. Money is your suit. What should I say to you? Should I not say, 'Hath a dog money? Is it possible a cur can lend 3,000 ducats? Or shall I bend low like a slave, and with bated breath and whispering humbleness say this, Fair sir, you spat on me on Wednesday last. You spurned me such a day. Another time you called me dog, and for these courtesies I'll lend you thus much money.' 'I am as like to call you so again, to spit on you again, to spurn you too,' burst out Antonio. 'If you will lend me this money, do not lend it as if to a friend, but rather as to your enemy, from whom, if he fails to pay, you can with better face exact the penalty.' Then Shylock suddenly turned round, and became very fawning, and pretended that his only wish was to be friends with Antonio, and have his love. He would supply his present needs, he said, and not take 1 farthing of interest. The only condition he imposed was that Antonio should go with him to a notary, and there in merry sport sign a bond that if the money were not repaid by a certain date, the forfeit should be a pound of flesh, cut off and taken from what part of the merchant's body it pleased Shylock. 'Certain in faith I'll seal such a bond, and say there is much kindness in the Jew,' said Antonio. 'You shall not seal such a bond for me,' cried Bassanio, aghast at the idea of such an agreement. 'Why, do not fear, man,' said Antonio. 'I will not forfeit it. Within the next 2 months, that's a month before the forfeit becomes due, I expect the return of thrice 3 times this bond.' And Shylock chimed in, pointing out that even if the bond did become forfeit, what should he gain by exacting the penalty? A pound of a man's flesh would be of no use to him, not nearly so profitable as the flesh of mutton, beef, or goat. 'Yes, Shylock, I will seal this bond,' declared Antonio, and it was useless for Bassanio to argue further, although his mind misgave him at such a sinister agreement.